Hello and welcome to today's Cordium webinar focused on cybersecurity and the regulator, a practical approach. My name is John Wilson, I'm Project Director here at Cordium. With me on the panel today are Pat Shea. Pat is the Managing Director and Partner at Cordium US and serves on the firm's Executive Management Committee. Pat leads Cordium's US Compliance Consulting Division and also runs our Boston office. With me is James Hogbin. He runs his own business, IP Sentinel, who Cordium have been working with in the UK to develop a more robust and practical-based response to increasingly complex data security agenda. James has held senior CTO positions within Lansdowne Partners, Aspect Capital, and Link Asset and Securities, as well as being a COO within RBS Capital Markets. On today's format, we will go through, Pat will introduce the US regulatory drivers for current focus on cybersecurity and data protection, and also discuss the regulator's role and the role of the SEC in terms of its examination focus, and also identify some of the themes that the SEC has identified as part of their review process. I'll then pick up on the UK regulatory environment, and it seems the FCA has remained resiliently silent on offering cybersecurity guidance and focusing much more on principles-based governance and enforcement. So then I'll pick up on some of the latest industry responses to the heightened cybersecurity risk. James will then consider some of the more practical aspects of cybersecurity and data protection, picking up on observations and common failings identified through our shared work in this area, as well as picking up on some of the case studies that you may have read in the news recently. Throughout, we'll be receiving questions you'd like to share with us using the webinar question screen. Please feel free to submit your questions through the question panel on the GoToWebinar application. It will be received here and we'll seek to answer the question during the course of the webinar, or if we can't, then we will aim to get back to you by email. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Pat. I read a quote recently that concerning the US response to the Sony Pictures hack that read, North Korea couldn't care less what the penalties are, it is not getting prosecuted. So what has been the American regulatory response in general to cybersecurity? What are firms doing to protect themselves, and what are those potential penalties?
Thanks, John. I'll go through those topics. First, thanks everybody for joining us today for an update on cybersecurity. This is definitely a topic that continues to generate focus from regulators, and certainly the industry, just evidenced by the number of you that have dialed in today. Governments and regulators continue to increase their flow of communication, their guidance, their focus on the threats of cybersecurity and the financial services industry. And my goal for today is to really try to provide an overview in the time that we have to just, talk through what we consider to be the main points, and try to pull out some of the practical pieces, as John mentioned, so you have some things that you can take back to your firm. To keep things in perspective, I know we're going to focus on the regulatory aspects, but just to make sure that people are looking at this slightly differently at times. Cybersecurity protections that each of your firms adopt are a small piece of a very large puzzle. We're all expected to do our part. I think that's the regulatory message. At a recent conference, SEC Commissioner Mary Jo White remarked, and I'll just read a quick quote, "Cybersecurity is a shared responsibility of all regulators and market participants, including investment advisors, to guard the broader financial system against intrusions." And I think that drives the point home pretty clearly that systemic risk is a big piece, and we need to look at things from an enterprise risk perspective, not just from the perspective of the threat of a regulator coming in and kicking the tires on your written information security program. So I just figured I'd start there, and with that I'll kind of dive into this slide here. The regulation of data security safeguards in the investment management industry is an overlapping system. We'll hit on some of the different regulatory perspectives today. In the U.S., you've got multiple federal agencies that have issued rules and guidance. You've got minimum standards. I'll try to pull out again some of the key components without going through too much detail. But just an early point of emphasis, just know that if you are to check the regulatory websites for FINRA, the SEC, and its Office of Compliance, Inspections, and Examinations, or for the CFTC and the National Futures Association, you will certainly find guidance in terms of what is expected. And again, we'll go through some of that today. I think the U.S. federal government's comprehensive national cybersecurity initiative is probably a good place to start. It was launched back in 2008, and it's been picking up steam ever since. And it's really an effort to coordinate federal, state, and local governments as well as the private sector. It emphasizes that desire to coordinate public and private sectors, and that's a clear message that coordination or collaboration between the government and the private sector is critical. Shifting gears to the regulatory perspective, I thought it might be helpful to quickly just go through a bit of history for where we were last year, because that really starts to clarify where we are here in 2015. In 2014, the regulatory priorities announced by the SEC, FINRA, and the CFTC made it clear that cybersecurity is a big issue. So there was no hiding that fact. In 2014, there was a compliance outreach program that emphasized adequacy of resources that you're allocating to managing cyber threats, effectiveness of your policies, and so on. So again, getting the message out to people. In March of 2014, there was an SEC roundtable where the SEC and industry representatives again emphasized the importance for cybersecurity and that integrity of the market system, as well as data protection of your customer data. In April 2014, the SEC published a risk alert which announced a series of examinations to try to get into some firms and really figure out what the cybersecurity risks were and to assess cybersecurity preparedness. And then throughout 2014, they went ahead and they executed on those exams. They sent teams into various firms, and if you recall, if you noticed last year, they had actually provided the list of information or the document request list that they were going to be providing during those exams. So that open communication and transparency continued. So clearly regulators have been focused on making sure that registrants have guidelines to follow around their policies. And just as an example, the CFTC staff advisory that came out really set out a good group of themes. I'll just touch on them briefly without going into too much detail. Again, these are resources that are available to you. But implementing and maintaining a written information security policy, designating a specific employee or employees with security management oversight, identifying in writing your internal and external risks, so that risk assessment exercise, establishing processes and controls to assess and mitigate those risks, implementing safeguards to control the identified risks, training your staff, regularly testing, arranging for an independent party to test and monitor those systems. So you can see these are all, again, and there are others, but I won't go into each and every one, but these are all best practices that if you were to look at the FINRA guidelines, the SEC guidelines, or the CFTC guidelines, I think you would find that the themes, common themes, emerge across those regulatory bodies. And what I just went through was the CFTC's list, but there is consistency across. So as we shifted into 2015, the cybersecurity initiatives continued, and we can just jump over to the next slide there. U.S. regulators began to provide a slightly more detailed feedback in terms of what the industry was doing well and maybe what they weren't doing so well. So what had changed was certainly time had gone by. There had been more experience with cyber threats as well as the response from the industry, and there had also been this exam initiative that took place during 2014. So what they did in 2014 was they went out and they examined 57 broker-dealers and 49 registered investment advisors. They had announced those focus areas. As I mentioned, they had provided the document request list. so people could be prepared. And the big question throughout 2014 was really, what did the regulators find? I'd be talking to my clients, and they'd say, it seems awfully quiet. What's happening with these examinations of cybersecurity plans? And that was, if you paid attention to the communication, slightly by design. Last year was definitely, call it an assessment or a fact-finding mission by the exam teams. They were getting in, they were reviewing documentation, they were interviewing people, but they weren't necessarily doing a ton of testing behind the scenes. And we'll talk a little bit more how that may have shifted here in 2015. But in answer to that question, how did the exams go? And in keeping with the theme of transparency, in February 2015, the National Exam Program issued a risk alert called Cybersecurity Examination Sweep Summary, and that report, included some good news as well as some not so good news in terms of how seriously SEC registered entities were taking cybersecurity. And just a few of the statistics are the good side. The vast majority of examined BDs or broker-dealers and investment advisors had already adopted written information security policies. And this might be a good list for you as you think about what's going on within your firm and you think about benchmarking a little bit. In addition, the vast majority of those firms that were examined had conducted periodic risk assessments to identify their threats and their vulnerabilities and their potential business consequences. So firms were taking a hard look at their risk. The large majority of the firms that were examined had conducted firm-wide inventory and cataloging, mapping of their technology resources, really inventorying what do we have, so making sure that they had their arms around their quote-unquote assets. And then there was also a good theme that emerged that firms were utilizing those external standards and resources that were available to them to model their programs. Some of the weaker points that came out of that exam were that a large percentage of the firms that had been examined had reported being the subject of a cyber-related incident. While most of the BDs required risk assessment of their vendors, only a small percentage of the investment advisors were doing that. And then also you've got, related to broker-dealers, they had incorporated requirements relating cybersecurity risk into their contracts with vendors, but that theme hadn't really emerged as strongly on the IA side. So that gives you a little bit of a clue in terms of what was found during those examinations. So looking at that, where do we stand in 2015? Regulators have continued to issue reports on cybersecurity practices with a heavy focus on risk assessment and those standards. And one thing you may want to look into is the NIST standard. And I think that's a good framework for people to find, put out by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. That really sets out a game plan, so to speak, if you don't already have one. In 2015, as you can see here, the CFTC stepped up its game a little bit and provided more detail in terms of their cybersecurity oversight, and they really, again, continue the themes. They want to see, written information security, security risk analysis, ongoing training, documentation, and so on. So, that's, again, I think, a continuation of what we saw in 2014 is the big point about 2015. And then if we go over to the next slide, you can see, what did we learn? What's this 2015 cybersecurity examination initiative? Meaning, what's the next step? What should we expect? While examiners are certainly free to look at areas that they want, I think what firms can expect is that there is going to be slightly more testing. So in addition to document reviews and interviews of key people within the industry, there are going to be more testing. And the focus areas, some of which you can see outlined on this slide, I think you'll start to hear that they do line up a little bit with what was found back in 2014. So Looking at governance and risk assessment is a big area. Access rights and controls, and how are you doing in terms of understanding the basic systems and information access controls that you have in place. Do you have multi-factor authentication? How do you manage user credentials and so on? Data loss prevention is another big theme that will be reviewed. What controls do you have in place with respect to patch management? What controls do you have in place with respect to system configuration and so on? So these are big pieces. Vendor management, we talked about it earlier as a weakness coming out of the 2014 exams, something that's really getting emphasis this year, and we expect that is starting to, again, as we think about systemic risk, we think about this being an industry-wide issue, making sure that there's interplay and communication between you and your service providers, because certainly data gets shared in the normal course of business. Employee and vendor training is another big one. Again, you see that vendor piece there, but just making sure that the cybersecurity policies and procedures are being pushed down to the employee level, because that can be a big risk within the firm. And then another big theme, which you may have seen quite a bit in 2015, is just this incident response, and making sure that you have a plan and a policy and a process in place for responding to an incident. Again, part of that should be your thinking around communication, whether you're speaking with your investors, or you're speaking with the regulators, or you're speaking with the government, in terms of making sure that you're getting the word out if you are subject to an incident, to protect others and to further protect yourself. So those are the big themes. In terms of what firms are doing, I think I'll just wrap it up a little bit here, just to give you a little bit of this practical insight in terms of what we're seeing our clients do in response to all of this regulatory communication. The written information security policy is an ongoing theme, making sure that you have that document in working fashion, something that you should always be looking at. You should be updating, enhancing, tweaking as you move through your risk assessment process, or as things change within your firm. So that's an ongoing theme, but I think some of the specifics are making sure that you identify the person who has that primary responsibility, developing your incident response plan. Take a look at that if you haven't already, and make sure you have that as part of your WISP. And then you've got just the adding and upgrading of protections against cyber incidents, maybe something that James will talk a little bit more about as we go along, but that's advanced firewall technologies, network monitoring by a third party, reviewing access controls, adding a mobile device management policy and tools as needed. So, and then ultimately, I think one of the steps that we're seeing a lot of clients take is a cyber assessment by third-party specialists. That's a big theme as well. In the interest of time, I'll stop there and turn it back over to John, and then I'll react to any questions that may come up on my section. So we can turn it back over to John, and he can talk about the regulatory focus from the FCA perspective.
Thanks, Pat. And as Pat says, please do send through questions, because I'm sure there's a lot of questions and issues, concerns around these matters. I think what Pat said out there in terms of the SEC's approach contrasts quite differently to the European and the UK's approach of the FCA, because there's a lot of ingrained sort of rule making there and review, which we haven't seen within the UK and Europe. But in terms of, if I could just go through the sort of government response down to industry levels, at the European level, we've had the European Commission's 2013 Cybersecurity Strategy, which was setting out the EU's priorities in terms of cybersecurity. And what they tended to do was focus much more at the time around principles, freedom and ownership, access to the cybersecurity as a form of promoting democratic reform and avoidance of censorship, security and our responsibilities, all of our responsibilities in that, rather than lawmaking, creating capacity, cybersecurity capacity in third countries, and helping to reduce the threat from those countries outside the EU, and also encouraging cooperation between other strategic partners such as the US and China. In the UK, the Office of Cybersecurity and Information Assurance supports the Cabinet Office ministers and also the National Security Council in determining cybersecurity priorities. It's dealing with things like the strategic direction on cybersecurity, supporting education and awareness, working with the private sector on exchanging information and promoting best practice. And the UK government has also been involved in strategies to raise business awareness around the threat of cybercrime, encouraging cybersecurity risk assessment management practices, and also sectoral guidance. There's been sectoral guidance published around corporate finance, as well as a focus on training, for some reason focusing on accountants, lawyers and non-executives in this space, but that's where they've been focusing their attention. And also we've had a beefing up of knowledge in terms of cybercrime and knowledge within the National Crime Agency by the creation of a National Cybercrime Unit and regional organised crime units around cybersecurity. And likewise with the EU, the UK government has also been focusing on encouraging international support around the development of cybercrime prevention strategies. So quite high-level stuff has been coming out from the government agency. And then if we turn to the FCA, I mean, cybersecurity and data strategy, you have to start with principles here. The backbone for any enforcement is going to be around these. And the principles that are most likely to be relevant and should be familiar to anyone here: Principle 2, skill, care and diligence. Principle 3, management and control. A firm must take reasonable care to organise and control its affairs responsibly and effectively with adequate risk management systems. I could possibly add there also the avoidance of financial crime. Now, the FCA hasn't actually written rules really around cybersecurity, and the guidance actually is quite lacking too. However, the FCA has raised the attention as important to its agenda. The annual business plan 2015-16 that sets the FCA's forthcoming priorities and highlights the importance of cybersecurity with respect to their concerns around the complexity and age of IT systems that they believe make it more difficult for firms to embed effective security measures across the firms. And they've also highlighted market exchanges and trading venues as high-profile examples where potential fraud can take place, and highlighted the increase in use and reliance on web-based front ends, both in the retail and wholesale sectors, as areas of concern. They talk about firms in certain business sectors like insurance that collect large volumes of data about customers that could be compromised, but that could also be true of wealth managers collecting personal data on persons that they're providing services to, or fund marketers collecting data to demonstrate appropriateness as they promote unregulated collective investment schemes. Hedge funds, private equity managers, they'll also have access to market-sensitive information that could be subject to threat. So the FCA certainly setting out sort of areas where they have concerns within the industry. Now, in response to this, the FCA, the PRA and the Bank of England are actually currently conducting thematic reviews on the visibility of IT resilience and the risk at board level. And I emphasise two things there. One is PRA involvement, so that suggests that they're focusing on the largest financial firms, but also the emphasis there on senior management responsibility. That's what this is about. They're focusing on management's responses rather than trying to set rules and plans for the industry itself. So are the rules actually silent on cybersecurity? Well, largely they are, but they do talk about data maintenance and prevention. So CISC 417 is business continuity, but talks about preserving essential data and ensuring timely recovery. CISC 818 deals with the firms and its auditors and access to outsourced data. And CISC 611 deals with establishing and maintaining adequate controls for countering the firm's use to further financial crime. So again, the framework set there without setting out the detail of what you need to do. They have, and they do refer to guidance. And in that guidance, the main guidance was published in 2008. And that was probably, that guidance has provided the backbone to most firms' data security policies until most recently, as firms have started to respond to the cybersecurity threat. And frankly, if you look back at that guidance, it was reflecting simpler times. It talks in terms of the FCA's focus on data security, things like laptops and things like that. And they actually said explicitly they did not examine the threat of data theft by criminals seeking to infiltrate firm systems. So hacking was not on their agenda at that time. As I mentioned, enforcement actions, they followed around people losing laptops or failing to encrypt data. But some of the key findings then are still relevant today. So they talked in terms of firms failing to identify all aspects of the data security risk that they faced. And they talked in terms of firms not appreciating the gravity of the risk, not having the expertise to assess the key risks, and many failing to devote adequate resources to this. And there's also a nice little bit of guidance from the FSA, as was, which the FCA may be happy to disown now, which is, to quote, there's too much focus on IT controls and too little on office procedures, monitoring and due diligence. So what this slide here is just actually pulling together some of the key principles that they were establishing at that time. Firms are responsible for defining the level of security arrangements proportionate to their business. The regulator will enforce it in the area, and data security should be subject to normal supervision. So compliance department, this even introduced the compliance department's interest in data security as an issue. Now that guidance was then updated, and it looked like a more comprehensive set of guidance until really you sort of look under the bonnet. It was published in 2013 and then updated further this year. And what the guidance was doing was drawing on various thematic reviews in the financial crime space, and included with that was sections on data security. And again, it was drawing on good and poor practice, and again more focus on control standards and less on the threat of an external cyber attack. I don't think cyber is hardly mentioned actually in the document. The part 2, which focuses on data security, is actually a republication of the 2008 guidance. So if you were actually following FCA guidance correctly back in 2013, there wasn't much new coming out of the FCA in 2013 or updated in 2015. So largely, although they've raised the profile of the issue for the industry, they haven't set new guidance to the industry. So if anyone is actually driving the focus on cybersecurity, it's probably three groups really. From my perspective, the criminals for one, because the success of their hacking, things like the 2014 Sony Pictures hack, has probably propelled these types of issues into the boardrooms better than any of this guidance and regulatory policy can ever do. And so people are now talking about, well, it can never happen to me, but no, they're now saying, can it happen to us? And I think James will probably testify in a moment to some of the cases where it has happened to many. But also, AIMA and HFS, the Hedge Fund Standards Board, they've been issuing guidance in this space. AIMA's sound practices for cybersecurity reinforces many issues that may well be familiar to us, and also things that Pat's been talking about there. Employee education and awareness, executive engagement, ongoing monitoring, proper procedures and auditing, self-testing, personal device control, managing the third-party and outsourcing relationships. And similarly, the Hedge Fund Standards Board's cybersecurity memo, that reinforces other familiar themes, like identifying your crown jewels, cyber risk management tools, quick win improvement planning, and incident response planning. And the HFSB paper is pretty good because it actually goes beyond the SEC and the FCA's programs, and it picks up themes that come from in other international bodies, things, again, possibly familiar, cyber resilience, health checks, protection of customer data standards, regulatory notifications, and also governance standards. Now, in addition to the industry bodies playing a role, we've also seen a rise in terms of due diligence. Large investors are focusing on this as part of their due diligence for investments, and also financial services firms becoming more aware of the risks that external outsourced providers may pose. And I think, the FCA probably would step back from this and look at this as a success from their perspectives, because what they're seeing is an industry-led response to the matter, which is something that it would like to see from financial services firms, displaying the right cultures and the right behaviours. But I do wonder whether, 7 years have passed since the FCA have actually first of putting this in terms of guidance, and I wonder whether, had this got onto the management board's agendas at that time, then the planning would be 7 years more advanced than it actually seems. And I also wonder whether the focus on this evaluation and testing process also turns some of that questionable guidance from the FCA earlier on its head, that perhaps now everyone's talking about focus on office procedures, monitoring and due diligence, and not enough on IT control. Now, James, could you actually just pick up on areas of those IT lessons that people need to learn?
Absolutely. Thank you, John. Thank you very much. My name is James Hogbin. I work for a company called IP Sentinel. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. cybersecurity is a bit of a boil the ocean issue. It ranges from, should I have an antivirus program on my computer, through to, I need an incident response plan for my entire organization. And often when I go in and see clients, they don't really know where to start. So effectively, we go through a reasonably structured process. We outline what the security environment is, possibly what their threat surface, and that's an industry term meaning which bits and pieces could go wrong or be attacked by a cyber criminal or an insider threat. What are we protecting? What information? What are the crown jewels? What do the EU want protected? What do the FCA want protected? What do the FSA want, SEC want protected? Who are we protecting it from? In this era of outsourcing, in this era of part-time working, 0 hours contracts in the UK, call centres, actually maybe you are protecting your information from various different bits of your own internal organisation as much as you're protecting it from outsiders. And certainly if you're relying on a vendor chain, you need to ensure that they are adequately secure. And then another industry term, which is security posture. How aggressive do you as an organisation want to be in your response to any form of data breach or cyber breach? And is it something that you quietly deal with and move on, or is it something you stop the business to discover where the incident happened and where people broke in? And finally, I'll just outline the generic bits and pieces that we advise, and it's a relatively technical thing, I'm afraid, as to how to spot a bad actor and what they do within the organisation. So, if we look at the facts, there's a proportionality to this, because let's face it, if the government want to break into your organisation, they're going to. They have much better toys to do that sort of thing than anybody can afford to prevent them. And as we've seen from the Snowden bits and pieces of the NSA and the GCHQ information coming out, they're pretty good at breaking in. So actually, within the financial markets, the biggest threat to most professional, not retail organizations, most investment organizations, brokerages, advisors, is an insider threat. And I'll cover later why it is insiders that you need to guard against. Also, you will be hacked. On Jamie Oliver's website, which is the 6th most popular website in the UK, I believe, it's hosted pretty game-ending malware as part of its homepage 3 times this year. That means that if your staff idly surfed Jamie Oliver's website for a recipe at lunchtime, then their computers are utterly compromised straight away. I personally, when I was the CTO of a hedge fund, we had a very nasty infection because somebody had hijacked the CNN hockey results page. And we had a Canadian cost accountant who was keen on hockey. He clicked on the results page, and all of a sudden we had a ransomware 0-day bug within our environment. So it's going to happen. You can't protect against it. But it is important to try and stop it. Investors will want to know what you're doing, primarily in the UK, and regulators, if it all goes wrong, are definitely going to want to know how you've spotted people, what they did, what you've done to remediate it. So, just to rehash a little, why security? Well, we've covered what the governments do. We've got the EU involved, we've got the US involved, we've got the UK involved, both in terms of national and fairly partisan political outlooks on data and data security and the intervention of the state in people's technological lives. And also we've got the regulators, the big 3, CFTC, SEC and FCA. So we know all of that, but the biggest driver for any form of cyber security in the market at the minute is the investor. As part of every due diligence questionnaire that investors send out, there is a large section on cyber security. And this has only happened in the past 18 months. 2 years ago, you could quite happily be taken on in a prime brokerage arrangement with a tier 1 prime brokerage by showing them your business continuity plan and your business plan. Now you have to show them your incident response plan, explain how your data is secured and encrypted, and effectively, if you don't tick that box, you're not entering into a relationship with them. And that's a big change. So, note one, why security? Because effectively everybody's business model depends on having security. Why now? Just this week, Swedbank, this was yesterday, their website was broken into and customer account details were stolen. If we look what's happened in the last few months in the UK, TalkTalk, although Dido Harding, their boss, would say otherwise, have been compromised 3 times this year. Vodafone, while they were being interviewed about how bad TalkTalk were, actually admitted that they had also been compromised for customer data. Lloyds has lost a whole load of customer data from Royal Sun Alliance, and Barclays has offered the 3,000 account holders whose information was lost on a USB stick £250 each to make the problem go away. Also on trial this week were the 3 hackers that stole every single bit of customer data from JP Morgan in the US at the end of last year. That's every single account with social security number, banking details, banking history was stolen. The NASDAQ was hacked. Barclays Wealth, and this is quite an amusing one, this is insider threat at its best, a couple of white boy traders were trading people's personal information for sales targets. And that was all recorded and they were dealt with, but the people who were on that list were just collateral damage. Nobody has ever dealt with them. Very famous Target. Now, and this is an interesting point for the financial markets where we have things like ICAPs and operational risk. Target is a US retailer and effectively it was massively compromised in its payment systems. What that resulted in is 10% of all the credit cards, a figure from InfoWorld magazine, had to be reissued, and that's a cost to the bank, not to Target. Now, that sort of cost really needs to be in an operational risk environment because it can happen. And if you're a large card issuer, the fact that cybersecurity is causing a random cost to you needs to be taken down and looked. And we can go through the rest of them. And some of these things are really invidious and really technical. So the last, penultimate bullet point, the heartbleed bug. Now, when you do things online, HTTPS, you go to Amazon, the little bar turns green and there's a padlock there, and you feel safe and secure because everybody has always told you that SSL is safe and secure. Now, somebody broke that safety and security, and 23 to 24% of all HTTPS sites on the internet were useless. There was no protection. People could listen to all the traffic that was going. Now, a lot of this is done not in software, not in the computer program, but in hardware, in the box with the wires and pliers. So we're fairly used now to our iPhone downloading an updated app or an Android downloading an updated app, which is the patching process. Very rarely does your core box in the middle of the internet get upgraded, but these bugs live in those core boxes. So whether you like it or not, cybersecurity is happening all around you. But if we take a more detailed look at what we call the threat surface, i.e. all the bits and pieces that can go wrong, the top one has to be staff and suppliers. In the penetration test game, which is where you pay organizations to try and break into your organization, it's called a social pen test. And individuals put on what is known as the yellow jacket of invisibility, a high visibility jacket, don a clipboard, and say they've come to inspect the fire suppression system. And 9 times out of 10 you will be ushered straight into the server room or into the boss's office purely because you've turned up looking like an engineer. And the staff open the door for you, or the suppliers open the door for you. I also, when I was a CTO, had a very interesting penetration attempt from an external counterparty who had contacted our sales office overseas as a large investor and had them book a meeting with some of our team in the UK. The individual turned up, he was very plausible, but he was left alone in the meeting room before the meeting began because we assumed he was a businessman. Actually, he was planting devices, listening devices, in the boardroom, and he was planting devices that were sucking up data and sending it off-site. Now, we caught that because we set the Office for Bugs, but if we hadn't have done, we would have been utterly compromised without realizing it. Again, a social engineering attack that has nothing to do with technology and everything to do with human beings want to trust one another. The second most important vector is software. All of the source code for Adobe, so if you ever open a PDF or use Flash or Illustrator or whatever, all of the source code was stolen last year. And that source code has all of the encryption keys and trusted software bits and pieces that allow your computer just to install it wherever it is. And PDF is the de facto standard by which we send around pretty much everything. Marketing collateral, settlement notes, interesting proposals, whatever. And yet we now can't tell if Adobe, the software, is secure. Of course it's secure if you download it from the Adobe site, but if you type in Adobe into the internet and you don't really look at the link you get back, you could be downloading a compromised version of Adobe. Moving on to devices, everybody at work wants to plug in their iPhone or their Android into their computer to charge it and share their photos and this, that, and the other. And just a couple of weeks ago, the killer USB pen has arrived. So there's a USB pen that delivers a huge voltage to the USB port and it fries the device. That, again, doesn't matter if your USB port is switched off, that electricity is still going to fry the device. Also, putting a USB pen into a USB port is one of the most popular attack vectors for external actors trying to get into the organization. And I've used that successfully on 2 penetration exercises, and it's a very, very popular thing to do. Imaging. How many people knew before it got publicized deeply in the infosec technology sector that every single printer has a hard drive in that stores all of the images unencrypted? And if you want to upgrade your printer contract to encrypt the hard drive, it's going to cost you double or triple the money. But there's a large warehouse just outside Brighton where they all go to die, and you can buy an old printer for a couple of £100 with a hard drive full of images of people's passports, driving licenses, bank statements, because people use that material at work because they have to, work-life balance. As we go through trading applications, again, very specialized, but the fixed protocol by which probably 80% of the world's transactions get knocked around the planet has no inherent security in it. There's no checking within the fix whether it's a valid message or not. As long as it conforms to the protocol, it'll go. That's a big security problem. And then the rest of it, general applications, everybody's got them, they're bespoke, they're all done to a price, probably all riddled with security bugs because security costs money to do. And finally, social media. People taking other people's personalities, pretending to be them for pecuniary advantage. There was a delicious case in the US where people were searching through LinkedIn to find people's contact details and then sending them phishing emails around their corporate events by saying, your finance director is slagging you off on social media, constructing dummy pages, and then getting inside information and befriending people. So there's just a whole load of different threat services that on the surface of it seem to be okay, but actually if you scratch the surface, the bad guys found a way of subverting them. So what's important in the financial markets? Obviously company information, the brands, and increasingly in the EU, the systems, because the EU is focusing on personal data. The whole safe harbor fallout is about personal data. And companies have a lot of personal data, from the bank accounts and payrolls, CV records, they've got information in business continuity plans, in CRM systems, and losing that can actually cost real money if the EU laws are adhered to. 2% of global turnover is the proposed fine. And here are the figures. I did a little bit of maths. There are loads and loads of different surveys from a whole load of really good people. And this is sort of taking them all and averaging them. So if you look at information leakage, breaches, cybersecurity, pretty much 60 to 70% of it is internal. It's an employee. They didn't mean to leave the laptop on the train, they just did. Or they're leaving and they just wanted to take their 3 customer bits of documentation with them to help them in their new job. Or the sysadmins typed the wrong letter in to a long chain of commands and accidentally put the entire payment database on the internet for everybody to see. Now, 34% of the time, about a third, it is external people, but largely they don't give a damn about your organization. What they're trying to do is build their criminal empire, and you're usually just collateral damage, unless of course you've got a load of credit card details. They want to use computers for denial of service attacks, for mining bitcoins, or for providing large amounts of computing power. We, at an institute of broker I worked at, were utterly compromised by people who were trying to find aliens with the SETI website, SETI screensaver. And that took over about 80% of our computer power over time as people were actually trying to find out whether aliens existed. Which again, it was a deliberate mistake, but it was a NASA thing, and it pretty much brought our company to a halt. So, how has the posture changed? Thinking has developed. It used to be that you put up really big rules around the outside, but once you were in, you were in. So you breached the firewall and breached the antivirus, and then you were knocking around in the environment. Current thinking is slightly more nuanced. So effectively, you leave bear traps throughout the organization, and the organization has become a learning and listening organization as far as the technology goes. And one can't underestimate the amount of training it actually needs for individuals. So I, in my guise as CTO, used to train my individuals never to give out their password over email. The week before I did it, I said to everybody at a company meeting, I'm going to send an email asking for your password. Do not respond to that email. Then the next Friday, I sent an email, admittedly not from me, from another address, asking for their username and password, and 86% of the company sent a username and password on response to that email. In fact, I got in trouble with the compliance officer because she was unable to respond because so many people had done it, but had to take it down, and she thought that the email system had gone down because she wasn't able to respond. Luckily, we saved her from herself by taking that action. So even if you tell people about it, they don't do it. So how do hackers behave? They actually turn out to be your employees. You're never going to spot a hacker, a bad actor, some of that third of people outside, because they are being a normal employee, which actually means you should just look at your normal employees. The best way of spotting a cyber attack, a data loss event, bad actors in your organization, be they hackers or be they bad staff, is to look for odd usage patterns. And this is human engineering. It's back to the social engineering that we started with. So developers shouldn't be looking at sales websites. Sales guys shouldn't be downloading their CRM onto a USB pen a week before they resign. If you've got bear traps, honeypot servers, they shouldn't ever be accessed. And what that is you've just put a dummy server in the middle of the environment that nobody knows about, and if anybody accesses it, you know that you've got a problem because nobody should be accessing it. So, how do you frustrate the hackers that are out there? And they refer to themselves as elite hacksaws. That's not just me misspelling it. And for elite hackers, you can actually take your insider threat. So how do you frustrate people trying to steal from you? Be they internal, external? You train your staff. You train your staff again and again and again. And it's really difficult because it's such a simple thing and people want to try and help people out. Yeah, I'll open the door for a man in a yellow high-vis jacket. Of course I'll send my boss's password to you if you're trying to fix his computer. That sort of thing happens all the time. And you absolutely need to train your staff not to do that. In terms of the security, make sure that there isn't a hard outer shell. There's a whole load of layers within the environment where you can catch the bad guy. And interestingly, when they studied what do InfoSec professionals do and what is their primary way of keeping themselves safe, it's keeping everything patched. It's not antivirus, it's not recording things, it is patching their system. Now, unfortunately, Microsoft rather screwed the pooch for that by issuing a patch yesterday that has broken Outlook for about 50% of the people that have installed it, but it's very sage advice. Everything should be patched all the time, as the vendor says so. So, in summary, what do you have to do? Again, banging on about it, staff training. Train your staff. Train your staff not to be so trusting of other people. Everything is an insider threat, because if a hacker's breaking in, they're in your environment. You know, it doesn't matter how they got in. They are pretending to be a systems administrator. They're pretending to be the CTO, CEO. So they are an insider. The whole thing is an insider threat view. Take digital fingerprints. So hackers or bad actors will try and frustrate you by covering their tracks. If you've taken all the logs away and locked them up in a central log aggregation, and again, this is part of the FTC's advice and also the FSA's advice when it was doing its financial crime bits and pieces, is that log management is one of the single most effective ways of remediating against an attack, to work out how it happened, where it happened, and what got lost. Put in honey trap servers. They're free to download on the internet, and effectively they are the best thing. If anybody accesses it, you've got a problem, because they're there and nobody should be accessing them. So the moment they see traffic, the moment somebody tries to log on to them, you know you've got somebody in your environment looking around, and they shouldn't be. And then the technical bits and pieces. And you do need proper technical people to do this. The network traffic, a lot of information gets hidden in the network traffic. So there's a technique called steganography, and working at a CTA, our quants would embed their trading models in pictures of their pets and send them out. So our firewall was seeing pictures, whereas actually it was trading models with a picture nailed on the front. And to catch that sort of baddie, you need to be doing some fairly deep packet inspection. And also you need to be scanning your environment for patching purposes and to make sure that there aren't any funky firewall, web servers, remote access servers that people have put into your environment. And finally, unfortunately, this is the message. Hackers, bad actors, bad employees are only ever going to do it once, and they will try everybody and everything to make it work. And if you're better than the next person, they'll go to the next person. If you're not as good as the next person, they'll arrive at your door. But that means you have to be good all the time. There's no second chances. Once the hacker's in and doing his bits and pieces, that's it, you're gone. That is me done. Thank you very much for your indulgence.
Thanks very much, James. I think it's probably just time for a couple of quick questions and just to get some feedback from. And if you have got questions, please send them through. Also, can I just remind you that the webinar is being recorded and it will be sent to delegates after the call. And also, you can access it via our YouTube channel, which I hope won't give you a bug when you do access it. If I listen to Pat, can I just ask you a question? We're a compliance consulting firm. Listen to James. You know, don't use Adobe. Don't let engineers through the door. Don't let staff access the Jamie Oliver website. Don't even respond to James' email because he's trying to hack you. Compliance professionals are being asked to sort of address this. How does compliance stay on top of such detailed sort of level requirements?
I think I had a little trouble hearing you, but I think you're basically, are you asking kind of how are firms taking it down to the level of detail that they need to really stay on top of the flow of communication and data? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, especially when a compliance officer is responsible for compliance and not IT. Yeah, what
right.
Resources?
Yeah, I mean there has been communication from the regulators that chief compliance officers, as a broad generalization, are not particularly suited to get into the technological aspects of what's required under our written information security policy. So from a CCO's perspective, it gets back to the framework and the policies that if you go back to the requirements that the SEC has sent out, meaning the documents that they're going to be, the information that they're going to be looking for, that gives you the clue. It gives the Chief Compliance Officer a clue in terms of what needs to be covered. And then I think the big theme, or one that I didn't mention earlier, but it's a good opportunity to talk about it now, is that a firm's cybersecurity approach needs to be a broad, all-encompassing, approach from across the firm. So the CCO can drive it, or whoever that person is that has been given primary responsibility over the cybersecurity program can drive it, but they need to involve management. They need to involve the IT group, whether that is in-house or third-party, and get the expertise in the various areas that are needed. Because it's not enough just to say, I don't really understand all that we're talking about today. You need to start to try to understand it, certainly from a high level, to make sure that you're protecting the firm and addressing the risks. I'll add, just there was a pretty recent SEC charge against an investment advisor that came out just this fall, and it's an interesting one. The name of the firm is RT Jones, and it kind of fits into this response. But just briefly, that firm had hundreds of thousands of individuals' information maintained on a third-party server, and the reason, the conclusion you can draw if you take a look at this, the SEC summary on this, is that the firm did not have a reasonable approach. They were very weak. In fact, they had not adopted any written policies and procedures to safeguard that customer information. They didn't conduct risk assessments. They didn't have a firewall to protect the web server. They didn't encrypt the data. So you can see at one end of the spectrum an approach that clearly falls below the expectations as compared to what we tried to summarize for you today.
I think it's always a fear that enforcement action for not being seen to be doing things, as opposed to that's almost as big a risk as actually being hacked or threatened yourself. James, a question came in from the webinar group around guidance. If there's any actual data protection guidance from ICO which covers this cybersecurity, is there one sort of place we can go to get guidance, or is it a question of mining it through the field?
So the ICO does have guidance. It has its principles that are on its website. And one of those principles is that data should always be securely kept, which, again, TalkTalk argues that doesn't mean you have to be encrypted, but pretty much the rest of the market argues it should be encrypted. If you want to look at the NIST website, that gives you a good amount of detail around information security, information protection. The GCHQ website gives you a large amount of information about how data hygiene and how you should organize your affairs such that your data is kept securely and transmitted securely. And then obviously there's all of the information that's embedded in Sysgate around regulatory outsourcing and some of the work in the ISO standards for security and incident response planning. So there's quite a lot out there in terms of formal recommendations.
Okay, thanks so much, James. I think that's probably time to take a wrap. So actually, thank you, Pat, thank you, James, thank you, Barry, for organising, and all the rest of the Cordium team for their involvement. Thank you for the questions that have been submitted. We will be looking to run a future webinar on business continuity standards. A similar area where lack of guidance, but perhaps another area where there's a focus on need for IT and the involvement of management. So for the time being, thanks very much for listening to the webinar, and we'll arrange a further webinar soon. Thank you.